I've started the recording now, so if you want to just say some stuff.
Testing 1, 2, 3. Hello, hello. This is James Kent from Seattle, Washington. It's 2017. The world is a mess, and here we are talking about drugs.
Okay, perfect. Seems about right. Hello, welcome back to Adventures Through the Mind. I am your host, as always, James W. Jesso. If you are watching this on YouTube, you will notice that I'm in a very different space than the last time you saw me doing an intro. I'm actually in a new house, and I have a new little studio space. This open door here, I'm going to correct later. Same with this blank space behind me. I've actually just got a really cool piece of art that is very exciting for me, and I look forward to showing you guys on the next episode to hang here in the blank space behind me. Also, you might notice, depending on how post-production goes, that there's a little bit of a reverb in this space, so I got to get some foam up in the corners just to keep the audio quality super, super high for you guys, because of course I'm always working very hard to increase the quality of this podcast in all possible forms, from the audio and the video, which is still in the midst of growing, and of course the quality of content, which is the number one, the quality of what you are experiencing when you tune in to this podcast. Today's guest is James Kent. He is a psychedelic journalist, to say the least, and he has been releasing something called the last 10 episodes of DoseNation. Now, he's been releasing a lot of psychedelic content over the course of many years, but most recently he's been producing something called the last 10 episodes, which, to paraphrase his description of, is an exploration of the dark side of psychedelic culture. And I don't mean shadow work or entity attachment. I mean something much darker than that, much more secretive, which at the beginning of the interview, you'll hear we reference multiple times what went behind the episodes and why he did the episodes and the backlash and the praise that he's gotten from the episodes without actually mentioning the content at all. It's very enticing, so just stay tuned. I promise not too far into the interview we actually start to unpack what it is that's so dark about these last 10 episodes. Before we jump into this episode, I just want to send a big thanks out to the patrons that support this show on Patreon. It is because of you that we are able to continue to grow the podcast, and I have been able to invest in not only this new space, but the capacity to actually give time to this podcast, as well as my various other forms of media online. Of course, being funded through an opt-in voluntary donation / tip-based revenue stream, such as through Patreon and PayPal, there's always room to grow. And currently, I am definitely seeking to meet a sustainability goal right now on my Patreon page. So please, if you have yet to, and you would love to, not only say thank you, but contribute to the furthering of this content, head over to jameswjesso.com/support, or just search James W. Jesso on Patreon to figure out ways that you can get involved in the exclusive little patron community and help support the show. Thank you very much, and enjoy this episode with James Kent of DoseNation. James Kent has been studying psychedelics for over 25 years. He was the editor of Psychedelic Illuminations Magazine, publisher of Trip Magazine, and founder of DoseNation.com. His book, Psychedelic Information Theory, is an examination of the physical processes behind psychedelic hallucination. His latest project is the final 10 episodes of the DoseNation podcast, where he explores the darker side of psychedelics and the psychedelic community. The final 3 episodes of the series will be released this fall. James, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me, James. It's great to be here.
So I first got exposed to your work, some time ago, and it was through Psychedelic Information Theory, your book. Now, I admittedly haven't read the whole thing. I've just explored some of the excerpts I've seen on various websites, and I also engaged some of your other articles, including, the infamous one, The Case Against Dmt Elves.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I was even on your podcast when it was being co-hosted with Jake Kettle, DoseNation, back a few years ago, talking about my book.
Mm-hmm, sure.
So what's got me to, prioritize getting on the show, because it's been floating around in my mind for the last little while, is what I mentioned in your intro, the last 10 episodes of DoseNation. I had actually gotten a message from one of the listeners or one of the people following me online and said, have you heard James Kent's last 10 episodes? And then he particularly said to me, I think you'll be interested in episode, I think it's episode 7 about psychedelic theories. And I said to him, I'm like, great, thank you. However, if it's going to put me through any sort of identity crisis or throw any of my ideas into question or through my reality into a loop in any way, I'm just going to have to hold back because I had way too much going on at the time.
Yeah, I totally understand.
And but then eventually, I was ready. I was in BC, Canada. I was basically on a 2-week sort of holiday. I'm like, let's give it a go. Started listening to it at number 1, and then consumed all of the 7 released episode in a matter of, I think, 3 days. And it actually did put me through a loop, especially the first episode. I was microdosing LSD that day, which was, I think, a good choice. And
okay.
Yeah, it definitely was like, wow, I'm extra subtle or extra supple to how powerful contemplating these ideas were. And sometimes the information's kind of jarring, and other times I felt myself reaffirmed and given permission on different feelings and perspectives I had been having as well. And other times I feel like I just flat out disagreed with your perspective. But all that being said, it's incredible, and I think might be some of the most important content to hit the current psychedelic scene, which is why I wanted to bring you on the show to break down some of that for the audience.
Yeah, well, I understand that a lot of the material presented in these episodes is, I think, challenging is the word that I'll use. I don't want to come out and say that all of the opinions that I'm voicing in these episodes are accurate. Mm-hmm. But they are lingering thoughts that I've had about my experience with psychedelics and the psychedelic community. And as I say in the podcasts, I've taken lots of notes over the years, and I have a stack of notebooks with handwritten scrawls in them, and different topics that I've always wanted to address. And a lot of these notes are kind of darker or more cynical observations about what's going on in the community. And being like a media guy or a hype guy, a publisher, someone who's trying to build a community or, exchange ideas around the community, I sort of set aside the more challenging or darker aspects, the topics that were giving me anxiety, or maybe if I introduced them would be giving the greater community anxiety about what I was talking about. Nobody wants somebody coming into their party and, immediately deconstructing everything that's going on and saying you're phony, you're fake, you're living a lie, et cetera, et cetera. Nobody wants that. And I was very, trepidatious about coming into this and letting all of these ideas out, even though I don't really know how strongly I feel about them, other than for many years they've nagged at me. Mm-hmm. And I thought, what am I going to do with these thoughts, these lingering thoughts that I have, or that I can't really, voice in a strong way without potentially offending somebody, or putting them through an identity crisis, or making them go back and re-examine from the very beginning, maybe their first introduction to psychedelics or their first conception about psychedelics, what they are. So I decided I was going to shut down DoseNation because it had kind of died its own organic death a couple of times, and reviving it was just getting to be too much work for me. So I said, okay, I'm just going to just go through all of these notes and blow them all out and get some feedback from the community. And maybe I'm full of it. Maybe I'm going to get some feedback that just says, oh, you're off base. Maybe I'm going to get some feedback that says, yay, I feel that way too. And I have to say that even though I had a lot of anxiety going into doing these episodes, just because of sort of the tricky nature of the things that I'm talking about. After I started doing them, it was very therapeutic. I felt like a lot of this stuff was evaporating off of me. If you can hear in the episodes that I have like a lot of residual anger about sort of attitudes in the community, about, purely positive aspects of psychedelic, of which there are plenty, but people tend to just sort of ignore or want to erase the historical darkness or the casualties that happened along the way. And I think that sort of those holes in the public memory of the psychedelic history and the people who have gone insane or the casualties who have died through experimentation, that made me angry. I mean, there was just some lingering thoughts about, okay, all of this stuff about the positivity and light and the spiritual awakening and the expanded consciousness, that's all fine. But it didn't actually meet up with my real world experience of how those ideas actually played out in people's lives. I didn't see spiritual awakening or expanded consciousness leading to any positive changes in people's lives. Mm-hmm. I saw a lot of confusion and disarray and people's lives being derailed or, people's lives being destroyed because of, legal entanglements or mental and emotional entanglements or family entanglements, or, people go through identity crises and become new people after taking psychedelics. And all of those things are powerful and unusual and strange, but I don't think they ever or I have never seen anybody actually sit down and look at what is this experiment doing to people? What is it doing to society? What are the positives? What are the negatives? And does the hype behind psychedelics actually meet the reality? And so all of these episodes are kind of these lingering, nagging thoughts about the disconnect that I see with a lot of the thought in the community and what's actually going on the ground. And I guess that was the basis for me starting, and I didn't really know where I was going. But after doing a few of these episodes, I kind of came to realize that I was trying to look at the different places where people took a wrong turn. People with the best intentions, either exploring or promoting psychedelics, somehow took a wrong turn and bad things happened. And maybe they couldn't even see that they were getting in too deep. And I think there are a lot of tragedies in the scene and in the culture that are not talked about. They're just kind of overlooked or forgotten. And I wanted to do kind of like a Tales from the Dark Side of the psychedelic community, where I go back and I dig through this history. There's not a lot of, investigative journalists doing a history of psychedelic culture. Mm-hmm. I saw it as a big open field that nobody was really working in. And I thought, well, maybe there's enough for a book here. Maybe there's not enough for a book here. I'm just going to do these last 10 episodes and, see how people react. And so far the response has been, I've got a couple negative hate mails, but overall the feedback that I've gotten has been really positive, with people saying, yeah, I don't agree with everything that you're saying, but I feel like all of this stuff needs to be said.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's definitely where my mind was at when listening to it as well. I mean, there was some difference in maybe the cosmological perspective on the nature of, like, say, God or spirituality, but a lot of things that you were saying, I think, are incredibly important pieces to consider. Why did you feel like now was the right time? I mean, I know that you said, okay, DoseNation's coming down and whatever else, but was there something about where the psychedelic culture is right now that made you feel like it was time to drop this type of information? You said you were apprehensive previously or reluctant because, of course, we all want to continue to maintain a sense of inclusion and acceptance into our social groups. And as a professional journalist, you want to be trusted in being welcomed into those groups so you can do your proper journalism. But what is it that made you feel like that now was the right time, that the psychedelic culture could receive what you had to say? And or did you even think that it was going to be the right time?
Yeah, I didn't. The timing is really a personal decision. After Psychedelic Information Theory, after I published that, I had sort of burned myself out on what I could learn about psychedelics. I topped out. I got sick of even thinking of the subject, and I took a couple years off where I didn't even think about it at all. And thanks to Jake Kettle, he kind of got me back into doing a podcast, and we did that for a couple years. And as we were going, and a lot of the stuff that I was doing on the podcast with Jake was sort of revisiting ideas that I had I'd kind of gone through before. We interviewed a lot of people. These are people who I had, probably interviewed before, had contact with before. So I was kind of retreading a lot of old ground. And by the time that project wrapped itself up, I thought, well, I don't really want to go back and do this all over again. I don't want to keep going back and retreading the same old ground. I think I'm done. I think I'm done with this. And I thought, there's really nothing left for me to say. And that was kind of the way I felt for, I don't know, years maybe. And it wasn't until I started going back through my journals and realizing all of like the sadness and negative energy that I was carrying around with me through some of my personal experiences and some of the experiences that my friends or family members had had. I had never expressed any of those feelings. I had always kept that sadness to myself. And I think over time, that sadness turned into anger, that I didn't have a forum to express this within the community, because I thought, and if I go out and say, I'm angry that you guys aren't talking about, the positive, you guys aren't talking about the potential negative fallouts that happen when people have a freak out, or I'm upset that nobody is addressing these lost people in the community. So it was just sort of like, well, if I don't have anything else left to say, I might as well burn out these last thoughts, because I can't carry them around with me for the rest of my life. I eventually have to get them out somewhere. And like I said, it has been very therapeutic, and it has forced me to go back and sort of look at the decisions that I made and, take a really tough look at some of the information that I put out into the world and ask myself, is this a responsible thing to do? And if I have been irresponsible in the past, how do I go back and fix that? How do I go back and tell people, hey, yeah, it is fun. It is a great thing to do. It is, a rewarding life experience to take psychedelics. But hey, you have to remember that there's this other side. And that's kind of where these 10 episodes came from. I just said, I just have to get this out. I'm getting older. I'm not going to have the energy to be doing stuff like this forever. I thought that I would just be able to get through 10 episodes in maybe 3 or 4 months, but now it's been almost a year since I've started, and I've been giving myself time between each episode because it takes a while for me to process. And each time I start into a new episode, I feel the old anxiety and depression coming up again, going back through all this old material and getting myself mentally strong enough to address those issues and feel like I have, the authority and experience to be an expert or in this field and, put myself on the line and potentially say some dumb things or potentially say some things that make me sound cynical and angry. I just decided, well, okay, if I sound that way, I sound that way. And I'm not going to hide those emotions anymore. I'm just going to let them out and see how people react. And thankfully, the reaction has been very positive. People have kind of been helping me along the way and sort of applauding my efforts to to expose some of the vulnerable parts of myself at the same time as I go around trying to expose some of the, hypocrisy or looking the other way that happens in the community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I definitely, I've reinforced multiple times now, appreciated it. I find it interesting. For myself, I know a lot of the information sometimes I get is when I'm randomly searching, I'm scrolling through newsfeed, and I find myself starting to get a little just bored with psychedelic journalism. And it feels like a lot of the same thing over and over again, which is kind of funny because that's ultimately what I'm doing is psychedelic journalism in some way. But I'm always trying to think about like what's different, what's interesting, what isn't being spoken about, what do people want to hear, and what is it that they don't realize that they want to hear but need to hear. And I noticed that, of course, now there's more talk about the risks associated to psychedelics, but often, and I'm guilty of it myself, seems like it's just included as an afterthought of like, oh yeah, you could have a bad experience, and oh yeah, if you have a predisposition towards psychosis or schizophrenia in the family, you might have it might trigger that. But it doesn't feel like, hey, let's have a really full-on discussion about how psychedelic usage and drug usage in general, but specifically psychedelics, can lead to psychosis, psychotic episodes, depending on the psychedelic, addiction, that there's issues in the culture with taking advantage of others, of megalomania, and what might very well be very delusional philosophical ideas that are embraced as though they are the literal truth. And I noticed that this was positively received and validated when I wrote an essay called Ayahuasca and I, which is about my first ayahuasca experience, which...
Yeah, I think I read that.
Yeah, the short synopsis to the listeners who might not have read it is, on my first, I was like, I only knew what I read about ayahuasca, which wasn't much. It was mostly fanaticism. And on my first night, every bit of fanatical desire was completely validated, and I was headfirst into like our Lord and Savior, the Mother Ayahuasca. And the second night, I had the opposite reaction and saw ayahuasca as a parasitic psychic entity that was feeding on the suffering and pleasures of mankind. And then by the end of that night, I realized actually it's neither of that. It's all a bunch of bullshit that I made up in my mind. It's simply an experience. And in sharing that, I started getting all these emails from people like, thank you for saying this. I did this and this in ayahuasca. I did these retreats, and I've never been the same, and I can't get out of it. And it's like a lot of, maybe not literal deaths that I know of, but I know that there are some of people who are casualties of this sort of fanaticism and not a clear discussion about things like psychosis and psychotic episodes and delusion, which is a huge piece of the last 10 episodes, at least, especially in the earlier parts of it. I want to unpack some of your thoughts on this, on psychosis, mania, and the issues surrounding people not having proper intellectual tools for parsing strong psychedelic experiences, and to quote you in our former dialogue about this, filling the holes with what you call bad or strange ideas. So what claim are you making in these episodes around psychosis and psychedelics, and what are the cultural impacts you see happening from psychedelic culture's lack of acknowledgement around it? Okay,
so I'll step back and give you a couple thoughts about things that you've mentioned in that piece.
Sure.
Yeah, there's always the one chapter in the book that says, oh yeah, these things can be dangerous. Right. There's always if you read a book on psychedelics, usually somebody will include a chapter at the end of the book, or maybe a paragraph in the introduction that says, you should be careful. You should, find a guide. You should get some training, whatever. The other thing that they say is, if you have a fragile psyche, you may be prone to a psychotic episode. And one of the things I talk about in one of the episodes is, how do you know if you have a fragile psyche? Mm-hmm. Nobody is diagnosed with a fragile psyche, by the age of 18 or 20 when people start experimenting with psychedelics. People, unless you've had like panic attacks or anxiety attacks that have been treated in your life up until that point, you may not know if you have a fragile psyche. You may not even know what a fragile psyche is. So the inherent danger is ambiguous for most people. They're like, oh, that's not me. I don't have a fragile psyche, so I don't need to worry about that. That's kind of where I was. But it turns out, technically, from a very clinical medical standpoint, I do have a fragile psyche. Mm-hmm. I'm ADHD. I'm a daydreamer. I'm like a very active lucid dreamer. I'm distracted and sort of in my head most of the time. I have symptoms of manic depression, bipolar, chronic depression, which I manage and treat fairly successfully. I'm not as productive as I should be, but I keep myself going, and I don't let those things slow me down too much. But back when I started, I had no idea I had a fragile psyche, and maybe if if I had like a podcast like this to listen to have somebody give me the descriptors of, well, what might be classified as a fragile psyche, I may have been more careful. Mm-hmm. I may have been more careful in my experimentation. But instead I was, really gung ho, even though I would take like maybe half of what the other people that I was with were taking, and I would be tripping just as hard or twice as hard as they were, because somehow I could just really easily fall into that trance state, that visual trance state. It's just kind of a natural response for me to just go right there and not fight it, just go with the ride and not fight it. And so the fact that there are people, and the one of the weird things is that I have a feeling that people with fragile psyches are maybe more attracted to psychedelics than people who have, very robust psyches, because they are more prone to being curious and experimental with their thoughts and their minds. They're more comfortable with letting their minds go to strange and unusual places. Right? If you have a fragile psyche, that's kind of one of the benchmarks, is that you allow yourself to have these, psychotic daydreams or whatever, whether they're power fantasies or anxiety fantasies or paranoia. All of that stuff is sort of, it sets you up for really enjoying the psychedelic experience. Mm-hmm. It's something that's like, oh yeah, I recognize this place as being like my special creative place, or my well of, creation, or my well of inspiration. This is the thing that I like more than everything else. And maybe those people are more susceptible to, personality change or psychosis or delusion in the wake of psychedelic use, and how that affects the culture at large. I still am not sure what the net positive or negative is. I mean, we've had psychedelics in our society, en masse since the end of the 60s. And, there have been some casualties. The world has changed in dramatic ways because of technology and visionary thinking. So I think that there have been positive effects. I think there have been negative effects. Just like any technology that seems like it's a gift to the world, it could also get out of control and turn dangerous. And I don't think people really talk about psychedelics in that way, about what happens when they get out of control and turn dangerous. Like Charlie Manson has a commune of hippies that he turns into assassins. Okay, That's out of control.
Right, or the Weather Underground becoming leftist
terrorists. Right, the Weather Underground
Yeah.
becoming militarized. These are these things that you can't really foresee happening when you're sitting in your love circle, talking about how great creation is. But like I said, any technology can get out of hand, and that's the way I kind of view psychedelics as a technology. And just quickly about not having the intellectual tools to deal with what's going on in the experience. I kind of came to that idea after going back and reading some of Albert Hoffman and Aldous Huxley and all of these early explorers, these what I call European intellectuals. They sought to frame psychedelics in a social dynamic, because in the early mid-20th century, this was the greatest challenge of European intellectualism, is how do we shape society? There's this war between socialism and communism and capitalism and democracy and totalitarianism, and they're literal wars. They're literal wars in Europe about how are we going to organize people in our country, or how are we going to organize people on the planet? What is the proper social theory? What is the social organization tool that we're going to use? And when psychedelics were introduced into that mix, of course, all of these people immediately thought, how does this fit into the social organization? This is a social tool. This is something about, religion. This is something about transcendence. This is about social organizing, or as Albert Hoffman said, LSD is a medicine for fixing the ennui or desperation of the post-industrial man. And these are all really big, lofty social ideas that maybe have nothing to do with psychedelics, but have everything to do with the political basis or the intellectual theories that guide these thinkers' morals and ethics. And I don't think anybody has really kind of deconstructed psychedelic theory around that European intellectualism, because you see psychedelics in traditional cultures and they have none of that. They have none of this. We have lofty ideas about how psychedelics are gonna fix the endemic problems with the world. They're just simple spiritual tools that they use in their rituals. And there's a huge disconnect between kind of the social power theories of these European thinkers and the sort of religious and spiritual power theories of the indigenous thinkers that I could never really get my mind around. But it seems to me that the intellectual tools that people bring to psychedelics forces them to wedge the psychedelic experience into that paradigm, right? And if your paradigm is a spiritual one, you're going to see psychedelics as spiritual. If your paradigm is a social one, you're going to see it as a social thing. If your paradigm is, political, you're going to see it as a political thing. If your paradigm is medical, you're going to see it as a medical thing, right? So everybody has a slightly different set of tools for figuring out what the psychedelic experience is and then what it's for, which is something weird that happens with psychedelics, because people don't go, what is the heroin experience for? Nobody says, what is the end result or the promise of, the cocaine experience? People don't do that sort of deep examination. But there is a lot of hand-wringing and deep examination about what is the proper place for the psychedelic experience. What is the proper tools or use for the psychedelic experience? And to me, that's where things kind of get off the rails. You start thinking about a drug experience that may be personally profound and personally enlightening, and then you immediately want to turn that around and impose it on the rest of the world. And that kind of thinking is really kind of at the center of these episodes, because a lot of these people that I'm talking about in these episodes, when they get really deep into the psychedelic state and they start getting into levels of delusion, these social power fantasies start coming through about how do we use psychedelics to organize an intentional community, or affect the political outcome, or change the world, or save the world. There's these increasing levels of delusional megalomania that go from how can I change myself to be a different, better person, to how can we fix all the problems in the world with psychedelics. So the intellectual tools that people bring to psychedelics kind of guides the way that their outcomes go. And if they do become delusional at some point, those intellectual tools fail them. They fail them because they get so far ahead of themselves that they sound insane to everybody else. That if you're walking around the street saying we need to go back to an intentional community where we're living on a sustainable farm and growing our own food, that's one of the things that happened at the end of the 60s in the psychedelic movement is people said, we can't change the world. We need to drop out. Mm. And that became their intellectual tool for the psychedelic experience is we're taking it back to tribalism because that seems to be where it's going. But that sort of dropout tribalism is basically removing yourself from the rest of the world so that you don't have anybody challenging your delusions or challenging your misconceptions about how you may have gone off track about what the purpose of psychedelics is or what the purpose of society is. There's a lot of this really serious talk about, what the purpose is and what the meaning is. And ultimately, I think that those kind of ideas can be really self-defeating, especially if you get too deep into it.
Mm-hmm. That's actually a great segue to this next question that I had, and the one I had in between, I might say for later. We become delusional to the point where our ideas sound crazy to everyone else, and so we drop out, we disappear, and for example, on the internet, we might be able to find a community of people that we can build an echo chamber around, that they like our ideas or they're attached or fascinated to these ideas. And so they end up latching on, and eventually the person who is the source of or the wellspring of such ideas begins to take a place, like a higher place inside of a social hierarchy. And then these pockets sort of grow around them, and then this delusional megalomania can grow. I mean, this is obviously not exclusive to psychedelics. This is something that we see in different places in society. But you speak about where it lands in psychedelics. I think it was in episode 6 called The Master. You talk about ayahuasca cults, gurus, and shamanism, and you make a fairly bold claim that many so-called shamans are suffering ultimately from megalomania, and ayahuasca as ultimately being ritualistic poisoning. So I'm curious if you can explain your basis for these claims, and also maybe use it as a platform to share what you believe might be the dangers within the fully blossomed ayahuasca fetish of the current psychedelic culture.
Yeah, so when you're talking about, indigenous tribes or mestizo shamanism with ayahuasca, I think it's really difficult, or maybe sometimes a mistake, to impose sort of Western clinical diagnosis on shaman and, say, oh yeah, they're suffering from delusional megalomania. Because in a superstitious culture like that, where cause and effect isn't always really solidly linked up, where ritual and prayer are still somehow devices for delivering things to you and your people, whether it be healing or rain or food or whatever. You take that person out of that superstitious worldview and you bring them into a more clinical worldview, and you say, well, do you believe that you can, reach into the ayahuasca's dream space, spirit space, and, kill somebody miles away with your thought or with your black dart? And they say, oh yeah, absolutely. And you think, okay, well, that's a little delusional. Or do you think you can cure cancer or AIDS with the power of your spirit? And they go, oh yeah, absolutely, no problem. And you go on and on and on, and you go, well, can you fly? Oh, sure, I can fly. Can you shapeshift? Oh, absolutely, I can shapeshift. Can you see through the eyes of an animal? Oh yeah, totally. Can you go back and forth in time? Yeah, sure. Can you go to Mars? Oh, sure, I've been to Mars plenty of times. So when you start talking to some of these shaman, you realize that they will tell you that they can do anything. Now, I don't know how much of that is theater or how much of it they actually believe. It's very hard to parse through that as,
or what might be like a lost in translation as well, possibly.
Yeah, lost in translation. There's like a cultural divide there, and me as a cynical Westerner, I'm looking at the shaman thinking, yeah, okay, you're insane. But in their culture, they don't seem insane. They just seem powerful, right? And so in one culture, that power may be seen as a positive trait because this is a person we can trust. This is a person with answers. This is a person who seems confident that they know what they're doing. That's leadership. Leaders don't always know exactly what they're doing, but they pretend that they do really well, and they can fool other people with that kind of theater of confidence. So this theater of confidence that the shaman is all powerful and they can sort of, fix any problem with a little bit of, tobacco smoke and fairy dust is one of these archetypes that in Western culture we go, wow, that's magical. That's magical, or that's delusional. But in those cultures, that's just sort of like the normal. That's the normal thing. And if, you come in saying, oh, yeah, well, I have a God named Jesus that's powerful and he could cure the sick and he could, raise from the dead and all that stuff. And they go, oh, yeah, well, Jesus must have been a shaman. That's just the way they think. Mm-hmm. Right? They don't think, oh, Jesus, prophet, son of God. They go, oh, yeah, he sounds like a very powerful shaman. So the disconnect and the communication breakdown goes both ways. Now, their megalomania, the shamanic megalomania, is different than, say, a Western megalomania that will, land you in trouble with society. You get too big for your head in Western society, eventually someone's going to check you, right? And whether that's friends, family, law enforcement, the courts, the medical community.
Unless you have money.
Yeah, what's that?
Unless you have money.
Oh, unless you have money, right? So yeah, if you have money, megalomania can go unchecked, like we see in the American presidency. But the other part of your point, so the whole thing about them being delusional megalomaniacs is that what I'm trying to say is they will tell you that they can do anything. They will tell you that they can accomplish anything. And they're either lying or they're delusional megalomaniacs, or they maybe believe something in the middle, right? So I don't know for sure, and it's probably different for all of the different shaman that practice. I'm just sort of generalizing. But in general, when you hear about these shaman and the claims that they make and what they can do, to me it seems like, yeah, that person is really on a power trip. I mean, it's just that's kind of what it is. They're into the power. They like, using that power to influence people and maybe help people and heal people, maybe put a curse on somebody, maybe send a poison dart their way. Now, the thing about the ritual poisoning, it's not so much about the megalomania. It's about the physical effects. And this is a very subtle trick, and there's some nuance to it, and I don't want to get too deep into it. But ayahuasca itself, like I say, I just have a very basic term here. It's like a medicine is something that helps alleviate the symptoms of sickness, and a poison is something that creates the symptoms of sickness. And when you take ayahuasca, it creates the symptoms of sickness. You get ill, you vomit, your head swims, you get this fever and chills. Your body feels like it's emptying out. You feel like you're dying. And when you're at an ayahuasca ceremony, and I've been at a few where I have been on ayahuasca and where I have just been a sober observer, and you see people rolling around on the mats and vomiting and just making these horrible moaning noises, I look at the room of people and I say, God, these people all look like they've been poisoned. I mean, they look like they're dying. Yeah, just, if I didn't know any better, if I didn't know how the ayahuasca worked, I would say, God, they're poisoned. They're going to die. But of course, the ayahuasca works its way around and it turns into this really magical thing on the tail end after you realize that you're not dying, right? Once you get over the hump of the sickness where you're saying, oh my God, I'm dying, suddenly you go into this magical place. Now, this is a very nuanced trick of the shaman where through the administration of the drug, he can convince the participants, or at least plant the idea in the participant's head, that they are dying, that they are on death's door, that there is something, there is this crossing the veil between life and death that's happening as you go through this. And it is the shaman that is leading you there. And it is the shaman that's going to pull you back from death and bring you back to your body when you're all done. Even though that's all, part of the pharmacology of ayahuasca. Through the ritual, the shaman basically says to you, through demonstration, I have control over life and death. I have control over your life and death. When you drink this, you're trusting me that I'm not going to let you die. I'm going to take you right up to the edge. You're going to feel like you're dying. And then once you get there and come back and have this death and rebirth experience, you are going to realize the power. You're going to see the power of me taking you to death's door and dragging you back. So that's what I mean when I say it's a ritualistic poisoning. It's like this sacrament where we agree to let the shaman kill us. And then when we're at the lowest agony of our death, then the shaman's gonna, switch up the song, or he's gonna know, 40 minutes in, an hour in, everything's turning back to the light. And then he can change the ceremony so that people are like rising up either in spirit form or back in their bodies. And it's a really powerful thing. But again, it is kind of a ritual poisoning, and you need to be a little bit megalomaniac to think, yeah, I'm going to lead these people on a journey to, the other side of death and back, because that's just the way I roll.
Well, there's definitely, I find myself agreeing with a lot of what you're saying, and then also feeling some of my own perspectives sort of challenged, and I'm not necessarily here to debate your ideas because I want to give them a showcase. But I definitely have, in the past, like I mentioned in ayahuasca, and like I will likely mention in an upcoming book I'm going to be writing soon about my ayahuasca experiences, that a prevailing theme was I've been poisoned.
Yeah.
And
you did it to yourself.
Yeah, and I've done it to myself, and I'm dying, and it's my fault. And why am I doing this to myself? What do I have to prove? Like, these have been psychologically meaningful places to go to.
What did I do in my life to land myself here? Is the thing that
yeah. So and interestingly enough, listening to you talk about this in episode 6 gave me permission to be like, of course, it is a ritualistic poisoning. I've just never been able to admit it because I feel that way, but then I have to try to convince myself afterwards, like, no, that was just the hallucination, or no, that was the medicine, whatever it might be. But it can be a ritualistic poisoning with profound psychological meaningfulness, depending on how the space is held and how you enter and how you exit from it. And it can be very powerful, but yeah, it's I like to, I had this revelation in one of my last ayahuasca experiences, which I have done at this point 12 times, and I have very little interest in doing more. I feel complete, though I don't feel like a while there I was like, no way, not ayahuasca, blah, blah, blah. But after the 12th time, it was like I finally came to resolution with everything that the psychological illnesses and psychosis and disorder and post-traumatic stress and all the stuff that, some might say I just opened with the ayahuasca that was already there, or, reasonable to say that if it was opened by the ayahuasca there or not beforehand, ayahuasca brought it on, that it felt closed by the end, and then I could walk away being like, thanks for that 3-year journey of suffering, ayahuasca. I'm glad I learned all the stuff that I got from you, and I feel really blessed to have had a space to let me let it go at the end, and I'm ready to move on.
I wanted to step back and talk. Just one thing that you mentioned previously is that you were on a retreat and you said you did ayahuasca one night and it was great, and then you did ayahuasca the next night and it was a tragic experience.
Yeah,
one of the things that really blows my mind about reading about these retreats is that they will give you ayahuasca multiple nights in a row, or they'll do an ayahuasca ceremony and then a San Pedro ceremony and then an ayahuasca ceremony or something like that, 2-3 nights in a row. And I just think that that's irresponsible. I think that that's really irresponsible to do. I think, giving somebody at least a few days or a week in between trips is really, it's almost necessary to, integrate and rest and get your strength back for the next trip. Doing it multiple nights in a row, even though I understand why they do that in the retreat setting, because somebody may only be there for 3 or 4 days and they want to get as many trips in as possible. I just think it's dangerous. And I think that even though people may have amazing experiences on the second night, the third night, or whatever, I just think it's always better to take it slow. And in those situations, you can easily go from like a great trip one night to just being totally burned out and desolate the next night because you're just not ready to go back in. And that's something that I don't think a lot of the retreat centers take into account. They think, we might as well give people their money's worth, give them as much as we can before we send them home. And I don't know exactly how to fix that, but I think if people do find themselves in that position, it may be better to use caution than just go for it.
Yeah, I would definitely echo that from my own experiences. And I also, like you said, I understand it. I don't know if it's always better give them as much for their money worth as possible. But I think in certain circles, in certain sort of subcultures of ayahuasca, there's this strong belief that as long as you hold the space, the ayahuasca does everything for you. And so you just need to keep letting the ayahuasca in and break you down further and further and further and further so the ayahuasca can heal you. But I personally don't believe that's the case. I believe that it's incredible to be broken open and to go through those challenges and to go through those positivities and to have an experience that maybe was very turbulent, maybe was very beautiful, and then have a space within a community afterwards to talk about it, to see how it applies into your life, to unpack the stuff that obviously is left over from that. When you come to the edge of your death and maybe even see yourself dying in the room and see your dead body and your parents around you crying, like having that experience, real or not, can be very powerful and can be very traumatic if there isn't space to decompress that afterwards. And I believe that a lack of proper integration time and also a lack of oftentimes having a prevailing community to connect with, because we go on this retreat, we maybe only see people there once or twice. Maybe they're a part of the ayahuasca circle, but you only see them every time you go. Or maybe you go down to Peru, like myself. I went down to Peru. I was there for 2.5 weeks. I drank 8 times in 2 different groups. I had 1, 2, 3. Like I had basically Cambo and then a mushroom experience in success, like the day. And then in successive nights, it's like 1, 2, 3, day off, 1 more, day off, get dropped off at a retreat that same day, next night again, and then intermittent nights until I had reached up to 8 over 2.5 weeks. And I was isolated. I went through dieta. It was very troubling, actually. And the
dieta is another weird thing that I have trouble with, because when you talk about the retreat and those terms where they're breaking you down, the ayahuasca is breaking you down, and all I can think of is like the cult induction ceremonies or brainwashing techniques used by the military, where they put people on a very limited diet where they don't get a lot of fat and protein, and they sort of break down their will to resist, and then they feed them a lot of propaganda, and they don't let them sleep, and they feed them more propaganda, and they're malnourished, and they put them through a very emotionally challenging experience where they're forced to come to terms with some horrible truth about themselves. And then there's the community there to welcome them back with warm arms and say, it's okay, we've all been through it. And this cult induction or brainwashing, sort of breaking down the individual and then rebuilding them in a new image. What you just described, going down for 2 weeks and doing the dieta and doing 8 trips in 2 weeks, that's like textbook. That's like textbook breaking down someone's psyche, and softening them up to be rebuilt with whatever the goal or the line is. I don't think the psychedelic community has a blueprint for what you're supposed to be on the other side. Like a cult that says, well, you're supposed to come out of this, believing that the master is God, basically. The master is all powerful. Or in the government, you're supposed to come back, focused on the mission and ready to accomplish without question. With the psychedelic community, they break you down in these retreats under the auspices of healing. But are you really healed when you come out the other side? Or are you more like a blank slate? that's like kind of open to whatever. I mean, you're very vulnerable. You're emotionally vulnerable. You're intellectually vulnerable. And the other thing where you come back and you may have had a negative experience in one of these circles, and you go around the circle and you talk about what's happening, and somebody says, oh yeah, I had a really beautiful experience where, I saw angels and I was in this matrix of, colored lights. And somebody else says, oh yeah, I had this really opening experience where I could feel my heart expanding, and I could just, feel spirits like just going through my body, and it just felt like the most cleansing experience ever. And then they come to you and you're like, yeah, I saw my dead body and my parents. Nobody in the circle wants to hear that. And you don't even want to say that because you may be bumming out people in the circle. And I think that's a big problem. I mean, I've seen that happen where people are sitting around talking about their trips, and somebody goes into this, yeah, I had this really bad trip where I saw, this and this and this, my maggot-infested corpse by the side of the road, and I didn't know if I was alive or dead, and I could just see people tuning out. Mm-hmm. Like, oh, I don't want to hear this. This is heavy,
Well, I think this. Go ahead. Yeah. I was going to say this.
That's kind of where I was ending. So that's a problem. People don't want to hear the heavy darkness. Everyone wants to go around the circle and reaffirm and confirm everybody's light experience. But when someone comes up with a dark experience or a negative experience that they don't know what to deal with, it's sort of like, that's interesting. Okay, let's move on. There's not a whole lot of commiseration there that I've seen.
Yeah, I feel very similar. I also know that there are different types of circles. So the first circle I sat in, there wasn't integration. There was just social time at the retreat place afterwards, where people talk about their experiences. But ultimately, it felt, in hindsight, I feel like it was a cult conditioning kind of thing, because everyone was talking about Mother Ayahuasca and this and that, and I was 100% sure her spirit was inside of me and I could speak with her, and she was like teaching me, okay, whatever. So then another retreats that I went to in Peru, there was integration, but there was this weird thing where one person would speak, I would do my integration, for example, to one person who would then translate it in Spanish to the shaman, who then is first language was Shipibo, would then translate it back, his thoughts back to the assistant, who would give us back perspective. And it was always like, he says your experiences because you need to clean this and clean that. He will sing this song for you tomorrow night so that you can blah, blah, blah. And then my other one didn't really have that much extra integration stuff. In fact, the shaman was very, not even there, really. I felt like he wasn't there, but he believed that he had put enough good spirits into the land that he didn't really need to be there because the land would protect me. Maybe not. Either way, I felt like I needed a person there to hold my hand because I'm frightened and I'm dying and I think I'm going to shit my pants, whatever. And then this is the perspective.
Yeah, having the strength to say, I'm scared.
Yeah.
I'm afraid. I'm scared that this is bad for me. It's something that I don't think people in the psychedelic community feel that they're allowed to say.
I actually felt shame when I said it, exactly. Because they were like, "What? You want me to hold your hand?"
Yeah, you may feel shame, and you may feel that you've done something wrong. Mm-hmm. If I'm having a bad trip, it's my fault. I've done something wrong. There's something wrong with me that needs to be fixed because everybody else is having a good time. What's wrong with me? So yeah, being able to honestly say, yeah, I'm afraid, I need help, is really another one of the big messages that I wanted to get through in these episodes. But yeah, continue.
Well, the final retreat I was at really showed me what ayahuasca can offer to the Western mind, and it was based in sort of a trauma-informed psychotherapy, and trauma-informed like Peter Levine style. So the whole premise was going in there, building a safe and stable community, utilizing a certain type of somatic-based psychotherapy to hold space for people to talk about their challenges and what they've gone through in their lives and so on and so forth, to set the stage for an ayahuasca experience, which breaks you down even more so, exposes all of that stuff, brings it up really intensely. And then for the next day and a half, it's just circles to have everyone hear you and listen and help support you. And you can get private one-on-one dialogue with integrating it in a psychotherapeutic way. There was very little religious pretense. It was about you and your experience and helping you to resolve trauma and come back a fuller person. And I could see how breaking a person down so that you can help rebuild them. Like you go to a doctor and you trust them to give you drugs to save you. You have to trust that they're going to give you something that helps you. And I think that it is possible for ayahuasca to help people in the Western world. However, I don't believe there's a culture around it. I believe most of the culture around it is what you're describing, which I think gets people in trouble. Because then you have people who can never really return to their own lives because they now realize that only in the jungle can they find true meaning, spiritual meaningfulness. And then you have otherwise white Westerner people going down and becoming shamans, and maybe they become very good shamans that hold good space and are safe, and etc. But, and to quote one of my favorite thinkers, Stephen Jenkinson, at what point does that differentiate us from the rubber bearers of old to go down and take spiritual authenticity from a culture simply because ours doesn't have it anymore? And what is it really that healthy for a person if after ayahuasca they can't go back to their family or their friends or where they grew up because they can no longer put the strong psychedelic experiences they had in this religious jungle cosmology in Peru or wherever back into that homeland, so they have to reallocate their entire identity to somewhere else? Like, is that really something that's positively impacting a person? So I don't have the answer to that, but these are questions that I'm asking.
It's Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. Once you go native, right? How do you come back to the post-industrial world where everything is depersonalized? It's a very difficult challenge for a modern human to live in both of those cultures, and to try and bring the jungle culture back to Western civilization is just as hard and fraught with peril as bringing Western civilization to the jungle. I mean, bringing Western civilization to the jungle is, just one horror story after another of, tribes being wiped out, plots of land being burned and destroyed, companies going in and drilling for oil and exploiting the land and ripping apart the natural environment. But at the same time, there's a similar thing that's happening with the Western psyche as it's exposed to this jungle spirituality, where you come back to the Western world and you're no longer a puzzle piece that fits into what's going on. You're something other. You've become something more than the society that you live in, right? So that the destruction isn't so much happening to the land and to the people, it's happening to the cultural identity. Right. And I don't think the Western world has a place for people who have transpersonalized, right? They've kind of come out of themselves and seen the world as, a unified whole, and people are not really units that get shuffled around in some kind of spreadsheet. They're, an interconnected organism, right? And you can't come back to the Western world saying, no, I'm not a unit on a spreadsheet. I'm an interconnected organ. I'm part of an interconnected organism. Let's all get together on the big picture. It causes a lot of personal strife and tragedy when you come back and try to do that. There's a lot of stories of people who come back with only idealistic intentions to find out that everybody else thinks that they're a creep or a freak, right? Because they don't have the paradigm or the archetypes to fit that worldview into them. And then you get people like the Institute for Transpersonal Studies, where again you try to get European intellectualism to forward all of these lofty psychological ideas about, well, how do we fit magical reality into industrial society, and how do we live a transpersonal life and yet have a 9-to-5 job where we have to pay the rent. It's a tricky challenge, and I don't think anybody has ever actually gotten it right. I don't think and I honestly think that trying to move that magical paradigm of the jungle into the modern world is essentially a mistake. It's something that people do out of, maybe idealism or naivete or a desire to make themselves a better person or make the world a better place. But when they rub up against resistance, there's no blueprint for what to do then. You could drop out. You can you can find your specialized community where everybody agrees with you. But then you just distance yourself from your own culture. And not that, and like I said, and I think maybe the first episode, I don't want to make any value judgments about which culture is better than the other. I mean, I think most people in the psychedelic community would say Western culture is sick. It's diseased. The Industrial Revolution has kind of run away, and it's, taking over the planet, and there's all of this carnage and destruction, and we don't really know how to stop it unless we, incorporate these magical ideas from the past. And I don't think,
or at least get new perspective,
get new perspective, right? Yeah. And I don't know that that's the answer. I don't know that works. Right. I mean, intuitively, it seems like, yeah, this is the way to go. We need to better ourselves. We need to become transpersonal, and we need to see the bigger picture and understand that, we're all one organism. But I'm not sure that works when you come back to the world. I think that there's a lot of, social displacement that happens where you go, I'm no longer a part of this culture because I can see the, the dark, the bad things that happen in it, the hypocrisy that happens in it, the destruction, and, how people turn a blind eye, suffering, all of those things that happen in the modern world. But horrible stuff like that happens in every culture. Our culture, Western culture, is not, alone in its ability to mess things up. Right. It just happens on a much bigger scale now. It just happens on a nationwide scale, or even a global scale now, as opposed to something that just affects your tribe locally or just affects the tribes around you.
Right. Also, as being immersed in Western culture, I'm more likely to see the problems. Like if someone comes into my family home, I'll be able, like, as being, the son of my parents, I can see all the things about my parents that bug me, and I can see all the little dynamics that have been going on for years and years that kind of like irk me a little bit. I can see the room to grow, but as someone just walking in, they might just see the fact that I, am very openly comfortable around my parents, and I can hug them and tell them I love them and they support me. And so they only see the good bits, and there are good bits, but there's also uncomfortable bad bits in there too.
Right. And if you go into any other culture and you live with any other family for any period of time, you will eventually start to see, the bad things, the bad bits that everybody just sort of lives with and doesn't talk about because it's just part of life that they have to deal with. And you can point a finger and blame society and say, society bad, we need to fix you. Or you can just kind of shrug and say, well, all societies have their problems. How do we navigate that? How do we, keep ourselves strong in the face of adversity without feeling like we need to take on all the problems of the world ourselves. I mean, I think that's really kind of the balance everybody's trying to make. And if you can keep yourself strong in the face of adversity, I think that's the end goal. I think that's the best you can do. When you start saying, I'm going to go fix the things that are giving me anxiety, or I'm going to try to invent a new system that will allow the world to erase these problems, I think you've gone off the edge. You've gone too far. When really it should be about, keeping yourself together, keeping your emotional health together, keeping your family's emotional health together, and then hoping that emotional health somehow spreads out into your neighborhood and your family and your tribe, as opposed to going right to the top and saying, I need to save the world. I need to activate and heal the world, which is, a thread that I talk about in a couple of episodes where people get on that on that trend.
I actually, I agree with what you're saying. Almost like starting with cleaning your room before you try to, clean up the streets. Yeah. But I also think that people who have this desire to positively impact the world and want to introduce systems, alternative systems or new ideas, like that's how we get policy change, and that's how we get a lot of things. So I don't want to discourage or sound, from my own perspective, discourage those desires to make a really big positive impact. And but I understand too, getting into a place where it's like unreasonable and it's not opened to conforming in a way that allows it to actually fit, but just instead continues to be sort of self-contained and needs to be exactly like this and to replace what's there or whatever, rather than retrofitting things onto the system. And understandably so, a lot of the observations you had said the psychedelic community sees about Western culture, I definitely see that too. I think we're in a lot of trouble here in Western culture, and we need some sort of change. And I think getting new perspective is a good way to help at least acknowledge that change is needed, if not provide new ways of contemplating change. Like Albert Einstein's quote of, you can't solve a problem in the same level of consciousness or same frame of consciousness that created it. While at the same time, if I go and travel, I think travel is really good to give people new perspective. Right? Including psychedelic travel, because truly you're traveling somewhere different than where you are. But if you can't come back, then I think that even to like get into Joseph Campbell, the hero must return, and if you can't come back into the community, then I think that a part of that travel and all that it was learned is going to be wasted, because the idea that everything is just for me and it's all about, me and my little reality pod, my iPod reality is a false perception, and it's cultivated as a part of the same problems in Western society that puts us in the situation we're in globally right now. And I believe that when we travel, when we're on our whatever spiritual practice we're on, that this is a collective project in a way. Not that I'm here to save the world, but if I don't come back and share who I am in a way that lands with my community, then I believe that I'm doing a disservice to the people who I have claimed to love before I left. And so I think there's something to be said there about definitely traveling and keeping psychedelics in mind, in the same sense of like, well, you backpack to get an idea of what it's like for other cultures, and then you come back, you have a new frame of reference that influences the way you live your life. And then also considering all the comments you've made here about the dangers of slipping into sort of a delusional megalomania that I am going to fix the world. I know that I personally, I believe I went through processes around the same time that I was writing Decomposing the Shadow. I felt like I needed to write this book. I needed to show everyone that mushrooms can heal. And I stand behind the book. I think it's a good book. I think it was a positive contribution to the culture. And at the same time, I see that perhaps, like you had mentioned in the 10 episodes, after a very strong psychedelic experience, we come back and there's no social legitimization of what I just went through. And I need to have that legitimization because it was so deeply meaningful. And so I built that legitimization and then offered it to others in a way that in my mind, I was like keeping it grounded here with this world. But yeah, I think I just kind of went off on a little tread, so I'll just create space for you to respond.
I call it the savior syndrome, and I definitely went through it myself when I was in my mid-20s. And I think looking back on it, and even at the time, I knew this personally, even though I never really spoke it out loud or admitted it to myself. But I feel like when people get into that mode of, I'm gonna save the world, I'm gonna go out there and make a change and help people, I think that sometimes, especially like at those younger parts, in those younger periods of your life, that feeling, that motivation comes from like something that's empty or broken inside of you. Right? There's something empty and broken inside of you, and instead of seeing it that way, identifying it that way, you see problems with the world. And your depression and alienation, therefore, can only be resolved by action, by activating myself in the world. Mm-hmm. If I activate and I go out and fix these problems that are giving me anxiety or making me feel less than whole, I'm going to be doing the world a favor. But as I get older, I realize now that a lot of those emotions and feelings that I had about helping people and wanting to save people came from something that was missing inside of me, came from something that I was looking for that I didn't have. And struggling with depression and not finding, a peer group that's fulfilling, or not finding, an interpersonal relationship that's fulfilling. A lot of these feelings of alienation somehow manifest themselves in, activism. And I'm not saying that that's a bad thing. I'm saying that, if people feel those feelings, I just, would like them to take a deeper look at where they're coming from. And I'm not saying that activism shouldn't be pursued. I'm thinking that, I'm saying that when you have those altruistic feelings of wanting to reach out and help someone, maybe that's because there's something inside of you that needs to reach out and engage with other people, and it's not so much that you're seeking to fix the world. It's that you're looking to be heard. You're looking to be heard and respected in a peer group that appreciates your ideas, right? And when I personalize it that way, it's it's a little bit easier for me to deal with if I say that these episodes that I'm putting together, pointing out these issues that, are giving me the trouble and these nagging ideas. It's not because I want to go out and point the finger at somebody and say, you're doing something wrong, or that the psychedelic community is bad because of this. It's because I'm trying to identify the things in myself that were somehow missing or not whole, and how I recognize those same patterns happening in other people in the movement who think that they're going out and saying, I'm an expert and I'm going to tell everybody what's what, and this philosophy is going to be the new dynamite. It's more about how do I find my way in the world? How do I find my place in the world? How do I make the world a better place so that I can feel better about the system that I'm living in? And I think that, maybe personalizing it and making it more about seeking wholeness in yourself as opposed to saving the world is it's a healthier way to think about it, even though it's sort of, it's narcissistic and it limits it to your psyche. You're not Don Quixote out tipping windmills. If you get to that point where you're Don Quixote out tipping windmills, you're not going to be making friends. You're just going to be alienating people, right? They're going to be looking at you like, oh, who's that, that crazy person? What are they talking about with their crazy ideas about changing the world? So yeah, they're tricky issues, especially in the psychedelic community, because I think there's a lot of loneliness in the psychedelic community. I think there's a lot of people who get themselves into a headspace that's unique, right? That they can't share with anybody else except for maybe other people in the psychedelic community. And it can be isolating. It can be lonely. And instead of saying, I'm going to go out and change the world to make the world a more forgiving place for people who have, alternative ideas, you can maybe, think about gratitude and forgiveness for all the good things in the world, and maybe not feel so personally responsible for all the bad things in the world.
Mm-hmm. And quite possibly
that's helped me along the way. Anyway, those kind of thoughts have helped me. I don't know if they're going to help other people, but that's sort of where I'm coming from.
Yeah, I really feel you there, James. I also think it's possible to be in this place of like, what can help me feel most nourished, and also be taking action in a way that positively impacts people. For example, I mean, all of my work so far, even earlier on when I was like, I'm going to transform human consciousness, really early on in what I was doing. But even now it's that throughout the course of my psychedelic exploration and my own personal growth, and in my own journey with discovering what mental health is and how much of it I don't have, and where my opportunities to have more of it might be, is I've realized that, I also felt alone, and I also realized that there was a lot of stuff that I was missing. And in the process, I've been able to feel more capable of expressing that, and in doing so, in being vulnerable, and I'm sure like you'll agree with these last 10 episodes, you said you didn't know, like, could you talk about this? How would it be received? And then you did, and it's been very positive. Same for myself. It's like I express my vulnerability and I express these places that I'm in and I share it, these things that I'm missing. And I see that all of a sudden I'm not alone anymore because other people go, I feel that way too. And I've never been able to say it. And now they're not alone either. And then even things like this podcast and having you on the show is about exploring those things and then hopefully giving not only a sense of not being alone, but a sense of positive perspective that if at the very least acknowledging what's there or not there, and then hopefully acknowledging and offering an opportunity for people to find, discover, build, create, fill the hole that's inside of them in a way that positively contributes to their own lives. And in doing so, positively contributes to the progress of psychedelic culture, family culture, local communities, whatever, but contributing to the positive well-being of more and more people using the communications medium that we have available to us, such as podcasting.
Yeah, I think, definitely when I started Psychedelic Illuminations, or I started with Psychedelic Illuminations Magazine, I talk about in the first episode how I had, maybe the second episode, how I had like a really powerful trip on mushrooms. It was maybe my first psychotic experience where I heard people talking to me through the radio, and I saw an ambulance circling my block, and I became very paranoid that something beyond my control was happening, and I couldn't stop it. And every time I changed the station on the radio, the same song would keep coming on, and I would hear the same voices coming through. And I basically had to call my wife to come home and basically talk me down and say, come home from work and talk me down. I don't know. I've gotten myself into trouble. And she came home and talked me down, and I finally got over it. But I spent the rest of the day thinking, what happened there? How did I lose it so badly? What in that space where everything sort of became fluid and weird, what happened? What was that? It seems so real. That experience, even though like I said, I had been doing psychedelics for maybe a year or 2 years before that, that experience, that really profound, that freak out, is what led me to start seeking other people in the community. That's when I started writing letters to Terrence McKenna and Rick Doblin and Bruce Eisner and a bunch of people. I just wrote maybe 10 letters to everybody that I could find an address for, and started saying, hey, I'm a writer. I'm studying psychedelics. I want to interview you. I want to find out as much as I can, because I was looking for somebody to tell me what had happened. Because I had gotten myself isolated into a corner, and I had no idea what had happened. And nobody that I met or talked to could tell me what happened to me. And I was very frustrated by that. I was like, how could you be, proselytizing and advocating and preaching all this stuff about psychedelics, and then when someone comes to you and says, hey, this weird thing happened to me and it really rattled me and I'm not sure what it was, can you help me out? And they go, yeah, I don't know. It wasn't helpful at all. But I had, basically it was a psychotic episode. I had a psychotic episode, and I had some PTSD from that episode. I mean, now looking back on it, it's very clear to me that I went into a manic phase for a couple months after that, where I was extremely active and doing lots of stuff and reaching out and just trying to find people and trying to find a group where I could share that experience. And I met a lot of people, and that's, I'm where I am today in the community because of all of those contacts I made and because of all of those people that I met. But it really would have been helpful for me to have my 49-year-old self take me by the hand and go, yeah, you freaked out. You lost control and had a psychotic episode. And it's going to take you a while to recover. But, it will get better. Just take it easy and don't try not to take it too seriously and let it bog down or derail the rest of your life. And and if they could have given me like concrete examples of, yeah, this person went off the rails, and yeah, this person went off the rails, and yeah, this person did this, and this person drilled a hole in their head, and it's like, oh yeah, okay, I get it. People freak out and they go down the wrong path, and that's part of experimentation and exploration is failure. right? And you don't really learn unless you can fail and recover. And nobody really explained that to me. Nobody ever told me, yeah, it's okay to fail. It's okay to freak out. Just get your legs back under you, and try not to get in that same position again.
Mm-hmm. And you're not alone.
Yeah, and you're not alone. It happens to a lot of people. It happens to everybody. It happens to people at the top. Tim Leary freaked out. Terrence McKenna freaked out. Everybody in the psychedelic community has freaked out at some point. If they're telling you that they didn't, it's because maybe they only take MDMA, or they don't really take high doses
right.
or whatever. But anybody who's curious will eventually take that high dose that's just a little bit too much, that they can't control, and it rolls them. And, being rolled is I just kind of want to take the shame out of the failure in the community, and let people just, talk about it and say, you know what, it was messed up, and I made a mistake. And, I really just kind of need to forgive myself and get over it. But I know it happens to other people. So, we're all kind of, muddling through the experiment together. We need to embrace our failures and say, that's okay. You made it through. You've lived to see another day. Let's, make some positive steps forward now. So it's really about, finding the place where you feel comfortable admitting that you're not perfect, or that you're not strong, or that you don't have all the answers, and being okay with that, and just being able to say, you know what, it was foolish and wrong for me to think that I had all the answers, or to think that I was strong enough, or that I am perfectly mentally stable to take any kind of adversity that's thrown my way, because everybody has their breaking point. Everybody has the point where they're going to fall, and they're going to need to get back up. And, I really feel for the people out there who fail, who have, one of these horrible adverse experiences, and then they don't have anybody there to talk to. Mm. Right. And when you do, come into a message board or a community or something, people are not really forgiving or empathetic. So you asked me what was about the timing for why I started these episodes is, I go through periods where people are like thinking about me in the world. And I know, because I get like emails. There'll be a period of 2 weeks where I'll get like 5 emails. And then there'll be like 3 months where nobody emails me about psychedelics at all. And then there'll be a period of like another month where I get like 5 or 6 emails. And I don't know if people are just like discovering me on message boards or groups or whatever, but these emails always start with, hey, I'm really interested in talking to you about psychedelics. I kind of like what your rap is. I heard about you through this or that. And then after exchanging a couple able I get to the meat, which is, I had a really bad experience that I want to tell you about. And I get all of this confusion, this crazy confusion coming from people. And it's usually young people. It's usually young men who have, experimented and had a trip that rolled them, and they're still kind of stuck in it and working through it, and they have nobody to talk to. Mm-hmm. And maybe they've worked on a chain of a bunch of people, and they've been Googling around and looking at message boards, and suddenly they say, oh, well, here's this James Kent guy. Maybe I'll write him. And when they get to me, I try to give them like really solid, empathetic advice. Like, you got to take care of your mental health. You got to take care of yourself. You got to put all these ideas about whatever conspiracy or whatever, like social cause that's going to change the world. You got to put all that aside and let yourself settle down. You got to just kind of ground yourself and get back in yourself before trying to take on all this lofty philosophical stuff, because you're just going to get bogged down in it. And things are not going to get clearer the farther you go. They're just going to get more confusing and more alienating.
And interestingly, you have become the very people you reached out to. So you're speaking definitely directly from experience. And James, I want to thank you for being on the show today and offering your time. And I also want to thank you for everything that have been doing throughout your 25 years in journalism, in the psychedelic culture, and specifically with the last 10 episodes. And I'm really looking forward to hearing the final 3 in the coming months.
Yeah. And I wanted to say that I've really enjoyed watching your career and the progress that you're making through the struggle, and you're like doing it very publicly, and you've been, courageous enough to share some of your darker experiences right up front. I mean, in some of your early work, it's, right up front talking about how, you were devastated by a mushroom experience in Thailand, or whatever your formative experiences were. Mm-hmm. It's refreshing to see new people coming through the community, especially people who do feel the need to, find a public voice and, try to be active in the community. Because people, I think, are like seeking leaders. I don't like, being a leader. I don't like calling myself an advocate. I am just more of a journalist. I like to write about experiences and write about things. So, having people in the community that other people can look up to as, just being a public figure, not even just being a leader, but just having the courage to say, yeah, I'm a psychedelic person, and I have thoughts and opinions, and these are my beliefs. And I think, having people like you in the community is basically a good thing. Even though in the past, psychedelic celebrities, they can get off the rails, and hopefully that's in the past. I think, like I was telling somebody who wrote to me, I think that my personal problems with the psychedelic community, they may be generational, because I did come up with a lot of people who didn't really know how the substances worked. We're kind of trying to screwdriver all of these crackpot theories into the experience to make sense of it, but they weren't really, clarifying anything. They weren't clarifying anything. They were just giving people more, propaganda or stuff to be delusional about. I think these days people are a little bit more savvy. There's more information on the internet, and there's more resources for people to check themselves when they do sort of get out of their heads and start filling the void with cultish or strange ideas. So hopefully people can grow from the experience of the 90s that we all lived through, and learn some lessons. And just I like to think about keeping psychedelics fun, right? And when you start getting into philosophy and social theory and all of this talk about Western civilization and the world in crisis, the fun stops. It stops being fun, and it becomes a heavy, heavy thing, and it becomes like challenging for your psyche. Mm-hmm. And if people focused more on the fun, then the healing would take care of itself, right? If people just focus more on the fun and nurturing each other and, trying to preserve the good times and the bonding and, the mutual love, that's I think the best healing, really. And not like going to the jungle and having some shaman wave a branch over you. It's more about, finding the good times with the people who value those experiences.
I know that there's a lot of work to be done, and we don't want to. I don't want to not be in a working mode, but at the same time, we're definitely. I feel take ourselves too seriously and forget that without play we're undernourished. Without play we can't do good work in the world. And I also wanted to thank you for your acknowledgments of what I'm doing. I really appreciate that. And as a sign off, maybe you could offer the people here, the listeners, where they can find out more about your work, maybe where they could get your book, Psychedelic Information Theory, and where they can check out these last 10 episodes.
Yeah, you can just go to DoseNation.com to find the episodes. It's up to number 7. Number 8 should be out maybe next week. I'm halfway through it. It's a long one. These episodes are sometimes 2 hours, 2.5 hours. This one may be 3 hours or more, because there's just a lot of material in this specific topic. But Psychedelic Information Theory, you can just Google Psychedelic Information Theory, or on DoseNation. There is an ad for Psychedelic Information Theory in the right-hand column that you can click through. It's on Amazon. You can you can find the PDF download for free online. It's available on the website at psychedelicinformationtheory.com. So yeah, it's all of my stuff that I've done with psychedelics. I like to make freely available. You can buy a copy of the book if you want a hard copy, but if you just want to read it and check it out, it's all available online. So
great. Well, much appreciated. For the listeners of the show, all the links that he just mentioned will be available in the show notes. If you happen to forget it, it should be right there on the device or on the platform that you are watching or listening to this episode on, so you can jump over and take a deeper look at James's work or pick up a copy of his book. James, thanks again for being on the show.
Yeah, thank you. And keep up the good work.
Thanks. Well, that's it. Thank you for tuning into the show again. This has been Adventures Through the Mind. If you haven't yet, please subscribe so you can continue to be notified when this podcast releases. If you're on YouTube, click the little bell there next to the subscribe button and make sure you're getting notifications as to when new videos are being released. I release more than just podcasts. I also release smaller videos on various topics relating to spirituality, psychedelics, mental health, and beyond. And of course, a huge thanks to my patrons on Patreon and the people leaving donations via PayPal. It's I deeply appreciate. In fact, deeply appreciate does not even come close to describe how grateful I am and how essential this voluntary contribution is to the continuation of this podcast and the various other forms of my work. So thank you very much. If you're watching this on YouTube, up in the corner, you will see some names, and those are the names of people who are contributing significantly to the podcast. So specifically to y'all folks, thank you. Thank you. For everyone else who has yet to become a patron and would like to, please head over to patreon.com/James W. Jesso. It is a great way to say not only a thank you if you enjoyed this content, but to contribute to the further growth and development of this podcast, the YouTube channel, and the written work that is available on my website at jameswjesso.com. It is, like I said at the beginning of this, a totally voluntary opt-in model for revenue and economic funding that does not rely on things like advertising and other stuff like that. But here we are. We're at the end. I don't want to hold you up to any longer. So I will see you on the next episode of Adventures Through the Mind. Take care.